Okay, so I've had a couple of people ask me about my workflow for star trails, and I figured instead of trying to explain too much, I would just do a quick YouTube video. I, I prefer the stacking method with star trails rather than the super long exposure. It gives you more flexibility so that you don't end up with having a blown shot because a car drove by, and it just makes it easier to work with. It makes it easier to work with the plane trails and stuff like that I like to take out. So I'm going to go through go through my process here. I'm going to start from the point where the photos have already been imported into Lightroom. And I'm going to start with Lightroom, and then I move to StarStax, and then I will finish up in Photoshop. Um, and I'm using StarStax, a free version, or it's a free app available for Mac, available for Windows. You can do the same thing in Photoshop, but it takes a little bit longer to do. And I have done it before, but I prefer StarStax. It's a much easier, cleaner way to do it. But we're going to start out here with this 141 images. I did these a couple of nights ago when I went out with another photographer to try and get him started on night sky. I'm going to jump right into the develop mode or develop module. Um, I've already made my lens corrections. I was shooting Ronin in 14 millimeter. So from there, I shoot all of my shots in daylight balance. Our white balance is daylight for everything. That way I know exactly what it is, and then I can change it accordingly. My first step from there is usually just to run auto to see what auto will come up with. And it usually comes up with a pretty close approximation of what the white balance should be. And I do kind of like that. I think that's a good one. Um, and since I'm working with, this is going to be a Polaris shot, and I was facing north, so back into the city. So I'm going to drop the highlights down a bit to get rid of some of that air glow. And I'm going to push the shadows up just a bit to bring some of that foreground in. Again, I'm going to drop the whites down just a little bit, and then add a little bit back with some blacks. I don't like messing with clarity because it will make your sky grainy, so I tend not to do that. In this case, it looks like my horizon, looks like my camera was maybe off just a little bit, so I'm going to go in and let's try and shift the shot just a little bit. Make it look a little straighter. Yeah, I like the way that looks. And there you can see you got the Big Dipper here, Polaris here. My next correction is I'm going to go into details and adjust my sharpening just a little bit. I like to bring the radius down to about 5 and deploy masking. You can use the Option key on the Mac and the Alt key on Windows, and you click on that, and then you can drag your slider for your masking, and that should make those things just a little bit sharper. The next one I'm going to do is effects, and I'm going to put in just a little bit of dehaze. Not too much. That looks good there. That's going to bring enough of it out without bringing too much of it out. And then once you put that dehaze in, because it's going to darken it down some, I'll usually lighten it back up just a little bit because it will darken the entire shot out. Now you can come up and use a graduated mask and just dehaze the top, but since I'm doing this one pretty fast, I'm not going to bother with that. Once I get the shot to where it looks halfway decent, see, it's pretty clear. Foregrounds, yeah, looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Go back into library, and I'm going to choose the first one and all the way down to my final shot and sync settings. Yeah, I want to use everything synchronize. Lightroom will mess with you a little bit. As you see the thumbnails updating here, just because the thumbnails aren't updated doesn't mean that that hasn't been already done. You got to bear in mind Lightroom is non-destructive, so it won't touch them. And my next step is to keep them all selected. I'm going to right click and we are going to export. I'm going to export all of these shots and specific folder. I'm going to choose. This is kind of based on what you like to do to keep your stuff separated. And I've got this jump drive that I'm working on here for these shots. And I'm going to add a folder here called output so that I keep these things separated from the original shots. And I'm going to choose that there, put it in a subfolder, Polaris, just in case I decide to do anything else here. I'm going to call that Polaris. Since we're going to be doing some more stuff with these, I like to keep the quality at maximum. And I am exporting in JPEG. So we're going to click export. Preparing to export. You see it's going to export 141 files. That's going to take a few minutes to get that exported. So I am going to pause here and then I'm going to pick up where I left off with processing in StarStax after all of these files have been exported. The files had finished exporting from Lightroom and are now sitting in a folder. And so I have launched StarStax. Like I said, it's a free program available for download. It's StarStax. Really neat program for doing this type of work. Once StarStax launches, you're going to navigate to the folder. See if we can get it to pull up here. There we go. My output, Polaris shots, and boom. Click open. And they are now loaded in. These it's showing the first shot that we had there. Now StarStax is a real neat program for stacking these shots. Like I said, you can do them in Lightroom as well, but it gives you a couple of options for your blend modes, gap filling, darkening, all kinds of different things that you can do. We're going to use lightning. Comet mode has trails off the back end of them, that tapering trails. You can process them in reverse order if you want the comet trails going the other way. I always subtract dark images. That way, if you've got one that's too dark, it'll actually knock it out. And you can save after each step. That's useful for use. That's useful if you plan on doing time lapse. You can actually have time lapse of the star trails being created. I usually don't mess around with this stuff too much. All that stuff's kind of default. And once I get it set like I want to, we're going to hit process. And you will pretty quickly see it start to work. Sometimes I'll actually step away from the computer at this point and not really pay attention to what's going on. But then there are other times, especially if I know that it was a night that I probably had some plane trails associated with my shots. I'll sit here with it so that I can watch and see at what point in the processing that I had plane trails showing up. And I'm going to do another video shortly to show the workflow that I go through to actually knock the plane trails out. And you can see one plane trail right here. I was south of the city, and the airport's up north of the city, so you can usually see some airplanes passing over there. You can see we're almost done. It's actually a pretty quick little program. Doesn't take all that long to run. And we're done. Basic star trail. And from here, I am going to save the file out. I usually like to save it into the parent folder um, so that I can work with it from there. And I'm going to pause for a moment because I know when I go to launch Photoshop that's going to take a few minutes to come up, and I will finish up this image showing you how I process one of these in Photoshop.
Lightroom, and we have run StarStax, and we're going to do a final process in Photoshop using NIK Collection. We got Photoshop fired up here. Here is our image. The first thing that I do in Photoshop is usually run a curves layer, and I will option click or alt click on Windows machines to bring up my color corrections panel. And it's either going to be one of these two. I really kind of like this one because it gets rid of a bit of that air glow, so we're going to go with that. And I'm going to run a color FX filter in the NIK Collection. NIK Collection is now free to download from Google. Download it and it will automatically load itself as filters into your Photoshop and Lightroom. It likes to pull up the last filter that you ran. Usually the first filter that I'll run is tonal contrast, or the last filter, I'm sorry, that I run is tonal contrast. We're going to start off, let me make this just a little bit bigger here. Oops, there we go. I'm going to run a little bit of a dynamic contrast. Nah, that's pushing the light up just a little bit too much. Color correct, no, I don't like that. Does not look like Pro Contrast is going to do us much good, so we're going to jump straight into tonal contrast, and it will load up the previous settings that you had. Let's set everything back to 0. If you haven't used NIK Collection, it's well worth going over there and downloading it. There are a ton of great tools in it. You've got your histogram window down here that'll kind of show you where your image is as you're making adjustments. Highlight usually does not do much for these night sky shots, so I tend to leave it at 0. Midtones, as you pull the midtones in, you can see you'll start to get some separation between your darks and lights there. And I like to pull it all the way over and just see exactly what it's going to do, and it's a pretty harsh effect at that level. So I'm going to leave it at about 20%. Looks good. I usually don't do any saturation here. Instead, I'll come up and add this brilliance and warmth. When you add saturation to these star trail shots, you're adding, and you can see you're adding color into the stars down here, so you're getting a lot more color in your shot. On brilliance and warmth, you can actually see I don't like the way that looks, but if I pull it the other way, just a little bit, that looks pretty good. All right, I'm getting close to my final image here, and you can see the difference that makes. It really sharpens those out. It takes a lot of the air glow, and you can see it all the way up. The changes that we have made in Photoshop and NIK Collection. These light trail or these plane trails, I'm going to leave them into this image. It's kind of a personal preference. I don't care much for them, and what I'm probably going to end up doing is here shortly is another video to show you how to take those out, what my workflow is to take those out using Adobe Bridge and Photoshop. I don't like these lights over here. I don't think they add much to the image, so I'm going to take this in just a little bit. And you see I've got a ratio on there. I'm going to clear that out. Take that back out to full, because there was nothing wrong with that. I like that. And for me, my final process is to add a layer and throw a watermark on it. And then we're going to output our image. There we go. One thing I did forget to mention, let's back up here just a second. If you have anything that you need to correct in your image, you're going to wait till after you run the color FX, till after you run the NIK collection, because if you do the corrections before, you may overcorrected spots that are going to look bad. Usually as part of my final process, I'll kind of scan through here, and if I see anything that I don't like, here a little bit, we got a few little spots here. These are probably a couple of little hot spots, and they're not really bad. They just can tend to be slightly distracting. Also, when you take these plane trails out after your final process, you may end up seeing some little remnants in the image. You may not get them all out when you do your initial run through, and this is the time to go in and try to take those out. It looks good. And now we're ready to export. And I have a preset for JPEG. This cuts it down to 77%. It gives you a much smaller image, but you do not lose any image quality. When I'm exporting for web save to Facebook, any of the social media, cut the longest edge down to 20 by 40 or 2048 by whatever the smallest edge is. We're going to save that out. And I'm going to save that back into this jump. And we're actually going to change the name on this one to just Polaris 01. Always save it as a Photoshop file. You can save it as a Photoshop file. That's what it'll default to. I prefer TIFFs because they're a bit more universal, and including the layer data. It's going to create a big file, but if you need to go in and make any adjustments, it's pretty easy to go in and make adjustments with the layers. I'm going to pull up and show you the final image here, if I can get the Finder to launch. And that's our final image. And that's my process for star trails from Lightroom through StarStax, Photoshop, and NIK Collection.